Today we are going to talk about postmodernism. As with structuralism and post-structuralism, there is a great deal of debate about how exactly modernism and postmodernism differ. The two concepts are of different vintage. Modernism being a long-standing category which is of crucial importance in the understanding of 20th century culture, whereas the term postmodernism, as is well known, has only become current since the 1980s. Modernism is the name given to the movement which dominated the arts and culture of the first half of the 20th century. Modernism was that earthquake in the arts which brought down much of the structure of pre-20th century practice in music, painting, literature, and architecture. One of the major epicenters of this earthquake seems to have been Vienna during the period of 1890 to 1910, but the effects were felt in France, Germany, Italy, and eventually even in Britain in art movements like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, and Futurism. Its aftershocks are still being felt today, and many of the structures it toppled have never been rebuilt. Without an understanding of modernism, then it is impossible to understand 20th century literature. In all the arts touched by modernism, what had been the most fundamental elements of practice were challenged and rejected. Thus, melody and harmony were put aside in music, perspective and direct pictorial representation were abandoned in painting in favor of degrees of abstraction. In architecture, traditional forms and materials like pitched roofs, domes, columns, wood, stone, and bricks were rejected in favor of plain geometrical forms, often executed in new materials like plate glass and concrete. In literature, finally, there was a rejection of traditional realism, like chronological plots, continuous narratives relayed by omniscient narrators, close endings, etc., in favor of experimental forms of various kinds. The period of high modernism was the 20 years from 1910 to 1930, and some of the literary high priests of the movement writing in English were T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, Virginia Woolf, Wallace Stevens, and Gertrude Stein, and writing in French or German, Marcel Proust, Stephen Mallarmé, André Gide, Franz Kafka, Rainer Maria Rilke. Some of the important characteristics of the literary modernism practiced by these writers including the following: a new emphasis on impressionism and subjectivity, that is, on how we see rather than what we see, a preoccupation evident in the use of the stream of consciousness technique. And here we conclude the first point. Second point, a movement in novels away from the apparent objectivity provided by such features as omniscient external narration, fixed narrative points of view, and clear cut moral positions. Between genre, so that novels tend to become more lyrical and poetic, for instance, and poems more documentary and prose like. And this concludes the third point. Fourth point, a new liking for fragmented forms, discontinuous narratives, and random seeming collages of disparate materials. This concludes the fourth point. Fifth point, a tendency towards reflexivity, so that poems, plays, and novels raise issues concerning their own nature, status, and role. The overall result of these shifts is to produce a literature which seems dedicated to experimentation and innovation. After its high point, modernism seemed to retreat considerably in the 1930s, partly, no doubt, because of the tensions generated in the decade of political and economic crisis, but a resurgence took place in the 1960s, a decade which has interesting points of similarity with the 1920s when modernism was at its height. However, modernism never regained the preeminence it had enjoyed in the earlier period. This gives us a rough indication of what and when modernism was. Does postmodernism then continue it or oppose it? To decide this, we need to attempt a working definition of this second term. As a starting point, we can take a selection of the most readily available descriptions of postmodernism. J. A. Cudden's entry in his Dictionary of Literary Terms and Literary Theory describes postmodernism as characterized by an eclectic approach, by a liking for aleatory writing and for parody and pastiche. So far, this doesn't really put much daylight between modernism and postmodernism, since the word eclectic suggests the use of the fragmented forms, which, as we have just said, are characteristics of modernism. Like Eliot's The Wasteland, for instance, is a collage of juxtaposed incomplete stories or fragments of stories. Also, aleatory forms, meaning those which incorporate an element of randomness or chance, were important to Dadaists of 1917, who, for instance, made poems from sentences plucked randomly from newspapers. The use of parody and pastiche finally is clearly related to the abandonment of the divine pretensions of authorship implicit in the omniscient narratorial stance, and this too was a vital element in modernism. It could be said, then, that only way of establishing the distinction between modernism and postmodernism is to dissolve the sequential link between them by retrospectively redefining certain aspects of modernism as postmodernism. According to this view, they are not two successive stages in the history of the arts, but two opposed moods or attitudes, differing as suggested in the next paragraph. The nature of the distinction between modernism and postmodernism is summarized in the excellent joint entry on the two terms in Jeremy Hawthorne's concise glossary of contemporary literary theory, Edward Arnold, 1992. Both, he says, give great prominence to fragmentation as a feature of 20th century art and culture, but they do so in very different moods. The modernist features it in such a way as to register a deep nostalgia for an earlier age when faith was full and authority intact. Ezra Pound, for instance, calls his major work, The Cantos, a rag bag, implying that this is all that is possible in the modern age, but also implying regret about that fact. In his poem Hugh Sullivan Morberly, he speaks of the First World War being fought for two gross of broken statues, for a few thousand battered books, and is evidently penned in lines from the same poem like a tawdry cheapness shall outlast our days, and we see to Callan decreed in the marketplace by the rise of commercialism at the expense of eternal verities. In the wasteland too, the persona says, as if despairingly of the poem, these fragments I have showed against my ruins. In instances like this, there is a tone of lament, pessimism, and despair about the world which finds its appropriate representation in these fractured art forms, like the collage of Kurt Schwitters, for example, which mix painted areas of canvas with random clippings from newspapers, timetables, and advertisements. For the postmodernist, by contrast, fragmentation is an exhilarating, liberating phenomenon symptomatic of our escape from the claustrophobic embrace of fixed systems of belief. In a word, the modernist laments fragmentation, while the postmodernist celebrates it. A second and related difference between the two is also a matter of tone or attitude. An important aspect of modernism was a fierce asceticism which found the over elaborate art forms of the 19th century deeply offensive and repulsive. This ascet this asceticism has one of its most characteristic and striking manifestations in the pronouncements of modernist architects such as Adolf Loos's proclamation that decoration is a crime, or Mies Wander Rose that less is more, or Lee Corbusier's that a house is a machine for living in. These pronouncements These pronouncements resulted in the shoebox and carbuncle buildings, which generated such hatred and opposition, particularly through the 1980s. But the high idealism they represent retains its power to move. The same refined asceticism is seen in literature in the minimalism, which, for instance, shrinks poems to narrow columns of two-word lines, registering rigorously sparse, pared down observations, or in the drama of Samuel Beckett, in which a play may be reduced to a running time of 13 minutes, with a single speaker, no set, and language which is sparse in the extreme. By contrast, again, postmodernism rejects the distinction between high and popular art, which was important in modernism, and believes in excess, in gaudiness, and in bad taste mixtures of qualities. It disdains the modernist asceticism as elitist and cheerfully mixes in the same building bits and pieces from different architectural periods. A mock Georgian pediment here, a tongue-in-cheek classical portico there. A similar postmodernist edifice in literature would be the Martin poetry of writers like Craig Rain or Christopher Reid, where bizarrely colorful mixtures of imagery, viewpoint, and vocabulary jostle on a surface which seems happy to be nothing but surface, without the depths of significance which a literary education trains us to seek out. Nothing could be further in spirit from the austere modernist asceticism.